and Marta from the London Feminist Film Festival for inviting me. Well, actually, I invited myself to come and present my research at the festival. And I wanted to thank Yulia and Nina. Yulia's here for a really fascinating film. It has so many resonances with my own research that I'm doing. So thank you so much. So I'm just going to talk about my own research here at the Rio. This is the title of my talk today, Desperately Seeking, Mapping the History of Intersectional Feminist Film Curatorial Collectives at the Rio 1980s to 1990s. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the Rio Cinema hosted and supported a variety of intersectional feminist curatorial activity, information on which is held in the Rio's archive. This archive not only stores vital information about how a radical intersectional feminist curatorial and programming practice shaped audiences and the circulation of radical queer and feminist and alternative moving image practices, but also fascinating clues concerning the cultural memory of the queer and feminist communities, collectives, artists and activists who through collective cultural resistance came to shape this marginalised history. My talk this afternoon reflects the research I've been doing at the Rio Archive, and I want to thank all the Rio Cinema staff, especially Ollie Meek, Andrew Woodyard and Tim and his team, who have been so welcoming and accommodating of my appetite to photograph filing cabinets, dusty storage boxes and faded bits of paper. My research at the Rio is part of my Sorry, I got bad. Sorry. Okay, try again. My research at the Rio is part of my PhD doctoral research at Birkbeck, which is investigating the hidden histories and strategies of curating queer feminist moving image as activism and advocacy in London from 1979 to 1995. This was a period of transformational collective queer and feminist curatorial activity whose intersections with radical queer feminist politics, theory, aesthetics and audiences continue to reverberate today. My research at the Rio has been fascinating and revelatory. It has shone a light on a marginalised period in the narrative of London's cultural film exhibition, a moment in time when women's film programming and intersectional feminist curatorial activism was intensely cultural and politically vibrant. The Rio Cinema began operations in 1909 when an enterprising local businesswoman, Clara Lutsky, converted her auctioneer's shop into one of London's very first cinemas, naming it the Kingsland Palace of Animated Pictures. After decades of expansion and change in ownership, by 1975, the Rio was under threat of closure due to contemporary cinema audiences turning to the newly available home videos. Since 1979, when an independent cooperative took over, the Rio has been running as a community cinema and a non-for-profit registered charity with an elected board of local people who act as volunteer trustees. And in 1999, the building became Grade 2 listed by English Heritage. So here's a photograph I found of the Rio from 1985. I know it's that year because it's just possible to see the film showing on the side, Desperately Seeking Susan, by Susan Seidelman. And that was released in the UK in 1985. So that's the title of my talk, Desperately Seeking, because to do queer feminist historiography and to engage with archival preservation, I often feel I'm searching in darkness. But I know how vital my research is and how high the stakes are, because the histories that get told and the way they're told determines what is remembered and what is forgotten. And this in turn reflects on how we as feminists, artists, women of colour, QTPOC people, activists, students and audiences see ourselves today. Joan Nestle, the lesbian feminist writer, teacher, activist and co-founder in 1974 of the Lesbian Her Story Archives in New York said, "The archive must be a collector of conversations, not a controller of them. At 76, I know we cannot predict what future communities under siege will need from us. Let us give them all the tracings we can. So here's some photos I took when I was shown the archive by the Rio's marketing manager, Andrew Woodyard, who's been extremely wonderful and helpful. I don't know if he's here, but he's been amazing. And this is in the Rio's attic. As you can see, there's archive materials yet to be catalogued. In the attic are filing cabinets full of monthly film programmes, posters, meeting notes, AGMs, press clippings, ephemera, kept in dark rooms, filing cabinets, and often unmarked paper folders. Yet here is an archive that contains the history, cultural memory, and index of radical queer and feminist film curatorial practice. Throughout the many months I've been visiting the Rio, I've endeavoured to document, photograph, and scan onto my memory stick this precious material. I've talked and gossiped with Rio staff members and various people who visited or who were involved with the Rio's feminist programming activities in the 80s and 90s, some of whom I hope are here today. Gossip is taken from B. Ruby Rich's idea that to gossip is to circumnavigate heteronormative hierarchies of knowledge, which acts as informal historiography, and that it is here that information, anecdotes, stories are able to flow unfiltered through alternative oral histories. Within all of this research, within all of this, I search for a queer feminist methodology to document, reactivate, regenerate this archive for the contemporary moment. This is an archive that holds information not only on the history of intersectional curatorial practices, but also how communities, collectives, and individuals who fall, as queer cultural theorist Judith Halberstam suggests, outside the neat models of narrative history, might be interpreted and remembered. Halberstam writes in the 2005 book, In a Queer Time and Place, Transgendered Bodies, Subcultural Lives, the project of the subcultural historiography demands that we look at the silences, the gaps, and the ruptures in the spaces of performances, and then we use them to tell disorderly narratives. An index of the intersectional curatorial, as an index of the intersectional curatorial activity at the Rio, I want to talk about two feminist collectives who were active in the Rio during the 80s and 90s. Firstly, the Rio Women's Cinema Group, established in February 1984 by a group of women associated with the Rio. They wrote, "We want to show the work of contemporary filmmakers, including shorts and animation, as well as rediscovering early women's directors such as Maya Deren, Alice Guy, and Lois Weber, and occasionally comparing them to Hollywood's women's films. We will invite the filmmakers to show some of the showings for discussion." And here's an example of the Rio Women's Cinema Group ephemera. So their programming statement's on the left, but I just want to draw your attention to the right, which is a piece of paper basically, but it's, for me, full of intelligence for my research. It's programming notes, but reading this is like a map. Here I can see ideas for upcoming film programs and the names of people who were connected with the group and other London feminist film collectors of the time. So, for example, there's a woman called Esther Ronay, who she was the founder member of the London Women's Film Group from 1972. And this group made two seminal radical feminist films in the 70s that were funded by the BFI, called The Amazing Equal Pay Show and Rapunzel Let Down Your Hair. So I urge you to check out those films. And then there's a name, Mary Pat Leese, who co-directed along with Joe Davis a fantastic film called Born and Bred from 1983, which was shown a lot at the Rio during this time by both the Rio Women's Cinema Group and the Women's Media Resource Project. And Joe and Mary were co-founders of the radical film collective Four Corners in Bethnal Green in 1973. Here's a flyer from the film of women's films at the Rio that ran from 12th to the 17th of May 1986, programmed by the Rio Women's Cinema Group. I think we might say that this is evidence of the Rio's earliest sister film festival, which we can link to the London Feminist Film Festival of today. You might see the date 1980 handwritten in pencil at the top of the flyer, which was the year that I initially thought that the festival ran. However, a chance meeting with Robert Ryder, head of cinema at the Barbican a couple of weeks ago, corrected this. Robert used to be the film programmer at the Rio in the 80s and the 90s, and he told me the correct date. Evidence and cross-checking is, as my supervisor tells me, essential for any feminist film historian. And here's some more examples of some of the flyers and some of the films that the Rio Women's Cinema Group was showing. So, for example, you can see Carrie Greenham Home, which was Beeban Kidron's seminal film she made about, with Amanda Richardson at Greenham Common, and then Lizzie Borden's Born in Flames, which was played a lot during the 80s and the 90s. Born in Flames obviously has had an amazing archival restoration on the film. It's now being screened a lot more, which is very exciting. And at the bottom you can see a connection between the miners' strike, raising money for the miners' strike, and feminist film screening like Harlan County, USA by Barbara Copel. The Women's Media Resource Project was an intersectional feminist collective funded by Hackney Council, Greater London Arts, and later the BFI. The project was formed as part of an open forum in 1983, and then a collective was formed a few months after, and meetings were held in different venues until 1985, when the collective started working with the Rio. I won't read out the whole thing, but this is what they wrote in 83 about what their remit was, specifically to kind of draw attention to bridging the gap, dividing women by class, race, education, age, occupation, ability, and sexual orientation. In keeping with the DIY feminist activism of the 80s, where women were encouraged to learn skills in traditionally male-dominated jobs, the collective believed in training women in technical jobs to work in the film and television and music industries, which increased women's jobs prospects and economic livelihoods, but also that women ultimately would have a positive and activist experience in that process. In 1987, a 32-seat screening room was installed in the Rio's basement. The Women's Media Resource Project took over this screening space for half the week, running a video lounge, and on the 5th of October in 1987 saw the launch of the first Women's National Video Festival, and to draw attention to the strategies of feminist collective activism and non-violent action for feminist activists of today. Greenham Common was a 19-year women-only peace camp surrounding the American nuclear base at Greenham Common in Berkshire. From 1981 to 2000, Greenham Common Peace Camp became a shining example of non-violent feminist action, changing both lives and laws. At its peak for over half a decade, hundreds of thousands of campaigners travelled to the site to protest the storage of cruise missiles on UK soil and to campaign for multilateral disarmament and non-proliferation. Greenham Common became the high-profile, long-lasting experiment in feminist cooperative living. The women of Greenham Common taught a generation how to protest, noted Beeban Kidron, co-director of Carrie Greenham Home, which I mentioned before. They went to live on the camp for 7 months. Our weekend comprised of film screenings, readings, singing, zine making, a pop-up drawing exhibition, and intergenerational discussions, which allowed for a diversity of histories and memories to come together and to speak to each other. Greenham women came to the screening as audience members, filmmakers, artists, activists, and academics. And just before our weekend, the Rio located a box of photographs in their basement from their incredible Tate Slide archive, showing the Hackney Women's Peace Camp outside the Hackney Town Hall around the time of the general election in 1983. So here's some of the amazing pictures that we showed that's here in the archive here, at the peace camp that they set up outside of Town Hall. Here's some of the women. I think at the bottom you can see they're being interviewed. There's a microphone there. Here's a Greenham granny confronting a policeman, which I really like. And this is one of the films we showed, Tina Keen's film In Our Hands, Greenham, from 1984. It's one of the short films that we showed over the weekend, which I think offers a perfect metaphor for what we were attempting to do, as it shows footage of the protest camps framed by the cut-out outlines of a woman's moving, dancing hands. So I think I'll end it there. I hope my talk has shed light on the fascinating history held in the Rio's archive of the Rio Women's Cinema Group and the Women's Media Resource Project, and their intersectional feminist curatorial and programming activities, and as they use this as a framework for activism and advocacy. Furthermore, I hope I've shown, as with Club to Femmes Green and Weekend, that by thinking through a materiality of practice, how the archive can be reassembled for new conversations, production of knowledges, collectivities and activism. Thanks.